Shadows of the past. Winston Porter sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the faint cracks in the ceiling as the first light of morning filtered through the curtains. Sleep had evaded him again. It was a cruel joke his mind played nightly, allowing him just enough rest to dream, but waking him before any peace could settle. His room was a shrine to routine, his uniform pressed and ready on the chair beside him, his shoes polished and neatly aligned by the door. Yet, no amount of order could fill the hollow ache in his chest. He glanced at the clock. 5:47 a.m. With a heavy sigh, Winston rose and began the motions of his day, each step as deliberate as it was weary. His hand hesitated at the door to Anna's room. The wood faded from years of touch. The door was ajar, just as it had been for 8 years, a habit born of hope that refused to die. He peeked inside, his gaze landing on the pink bedspread covered in tiny, hand-drawn stars. A small battered teddy bear, Mr. Snuggles, sat propped on the pillow. The bear's button eyes seemed to accuse him as much as they comforted him. "Morning, sweetheart," Winston whispered, his voice barely audible. It was a ritual he couldn't abandon, even if the room remained silent, the air heavy with absence. Downstairs, the house was equally quiet, save for the hum of the coffee maker. Winston's gaze lingered on a crayon drawing taped to the refrigerator, a relic of a time when laughter had filled these walls. 2 stick figures stood hand in hand under a bright yellow sun. "Daddy and me," the wobbly letters read, each a different color. The sight twisted a knife in his heart. He could still hear her giggling as she presented it to him all those years ago. With his mug in hand, Winston stared out the window. The world moved on without him, the distant hum of cars and the occasional bird song, a sharp contrast to the stillness inside. He drained his coffee and prepared to leave, steeling himself for another day as Officer Porter. The man everyone saw, not the grieving father he truly was. The police station bustled with morning activity, officers exchanging gratings and discussing cases. Winston walked through the corridors like a ghost, nodding politely but avoiding eye contact. His desk was a sanctuary of paperwork, each file a distraction from the gnawing void inside. He buried himself in reports, his pen moving mechanically over witness statements and incident logs. It was safer this way, keeping his mind occupied. "Morning, Winston," a familiar voice broke through his haze. Sean Miller, his partner, leaned casually against the edge of the desk, his usual grin replaced by a look of concern. "There's this new diner downtown. Great coffee, decent sandwiches. Wanna grab lunch later?" Winston shook his head, forcing a small smile. "Thanks, Sean, but I've got a lot to catch up on." Sean frowned but didn't push. "You can't keep living on coffee and paperwork, partner. You're not a machine." "I'll keep that in mind," Winston replied, his tone ending the conversation. He returned to his files, though his focus wavered. The afternoon passed in a blur of monotonous tasks. Near the end of his shift, Winston took to the patrol car, the rhythmic wipers slicing through the drizzle on his windshield. The rural roads were quiet, the kind of calm that let his mind wander to dangerous places. Memories of Anna surfaced unbidden, her laughter, her joy, her fear the night the storm took her. Ahead, a rusted blue station wagon swerved slightly before correcting. Winston's professional instincts kicked in, pulling him from his thoughts. Flipping on his lights, he watched the vehicle slow and pull onto the muddy shoulder. The rain soaked his uniform as he approached, the air heavy with the scent of wet earth. The driver, an elderly man with kind eyes and a steady voice, greeted him warmly. "Afternoon, officer. Did I do something wrong?" "You were weaving a bit back there," Winston said, keeping his tone professional but gentle. "License and registration, please." "Of course," the man said, reaching for his wallet. "Sorry about that. Long day of driving. My niece and I are heading to stay with family up north." As the man spoke, Winston's gaze shifted to the back seat. That was when the air left his lungs. A young woman sat there, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She couldn't have been more than 20. But it wasn't her age or posture that froze him. It was her eyes. Brown, flecked with gold in the left iris, tilted at the corners just so. They were Anna's eyes. "That's my niece, Annabelle," the driver said, noticing Winston's look. "She's a bit shy." Winston's heart raced as he studied her face. The resemblance was uncanny, the curve of her cheeks, the dimple in her chin. But there was something else, something missing. Annabelle's expression was blank, her gaze distant. She didn't recognize him. Winston handed back the paperwork, his hands trembling slightly. "Drive safely," he said, his voice barely steady. As the station wagon pulled away, he stood in the rain, his mind a storm of questions and possibilities. That night, Winston sat in his living room, the box of Anna's belongings open before him. The small room was dimly lit, the only sound the patter of rain against the windows. He pulled out her school photo, the smile in the picture both a comfort and a torment. Could it really be her? Could Annabelle Evans be his Anna? The rain intensified, each drop hammering his resolve. He didn't know how, but he would find out. If there was even a chance that she was his daughter, he wouldn't let her slip away again. The threads of a frayed past. The next morning, Winston sat at his desk, a cup of untouched coffee growing cold beside him. His mind refused to quiet, replaying the fleeting moments he'd seen Annabelle in the station wagon. Those eyes haunted him, so familiar and yet so distant. The logical part of his mind screamed for restraint. What he saw could be coincidence, but his heart wouldn't let go of the possibility. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out Anna's missing person file. The edges of the manila folder were worn, its contents memorized by a grieving father desperate for answers. He spread the photographs and documents across his desk, the weight of each piece heavier than the last. There was Anna's school picture, taken just weeks before the storm, her gap-toothed smile lighting up the frame. Next to it lay a police report stamped "closed," with "presumed drowned" typed in bold. The words felt like a betrayal, even now. They'd never found her body, never found anything. Logic said she was gone. But those eyes. He closed his eyes, gripping the edge of the desk. "Could it really be you, Anna?" He whispered into the silence. By mid-morning, Winston was back on patrol, but his thoughts remained on Annabelle Evans. His gut told him to follow up on her, but his training warned him against stepping over the line. If she wasn't Anna, he could destroy an innocent family's life. If she was, he couldn't bear to think of losing her again. As he drove through town, he found himself pulling into the parking lot of the local library. Inside, the familiar scent of old books greeted him. He approached the reference desk, where Mrs. Garland, the elderly librarian, peered over her glasses at him. "Officer Porter," she greeted him warmly. "What brings you here today?" "I need to research missing persons cases and family relocations," he said, keeping his tone professional, "particularly in areas affected by storms over the last few years." Mrs. Garland raised an eyebrow, but didn't press for details. "Storms always scatter people like leaves," she said thoughtfully as she led him to a computer terminal. "Sometimes they come back, sometimes they don't." Her words lingered in Winston's mind as he sifted through records. He found reports of displaced families, adoption cases, and community aid programs. Hours passed, and the rain outside began to pick up again. Just as he was about to give up, he stumbled upon a list of emergency shelters used during the storm 2 years ago. One caught his eye, a small, makeshift shelter near Miller Creek. Winston's heart quickened. That wasn't far from where the station wagon had been heading. The drive to Miller Creek felt both endless and too quick. The forest road was narrow and winding, the trees leaning over it like silent sentinels. Winston kept his eyes sharp, scanning for any signs of the station wagon. He didn't want to admit how much he hoped he'd find it. At last, he reached a small roadside motel, its neon sign flickering weakly against the gray sky. Winston stepped into the office, greeted by the smell of stale coffee and cigarette smoke. The clerk, A wiry man in his 60s looked up from his crossword puzzle. "Afternoon, officer," the man said, his voice gravelly. "What can I do for you?" Winston showed him his badge and a photo of Anna. "I'm looking for a young woman who might have stayed here. Dark hair, about 19 or 20, traveling with an older man in a blue station wagon." The clerk squinted at the photo, then nodded slowly. "Yeah, I saw a pair like that just the other night. Didn't stay here, though. Asked for directions out to Old Forest Road." Winston's chest tightened. "Old Forest Road. Are there houses out there?" "Not many," the clerk replied, scratching his chin. "Just a few old cabins. Not much else." Winston thanked the man and stepped back into the rain. His mind raced. Cabins on a secluded road. It fit. Joe Evans had mentioned heading to stay with family. Maybe that was where they were. The road grew rougher as Winston drove, his patrol car bouncing over potholes and loose gravel. The forest grew denser, the shadows deeper. Finally, he spotted fresh tire tracks in the mud. Tracks that matched the station wagon he pulled over. Winston pulled over and stepped out, the rain soaking through his uniform almost instantly. He followed the tracks on foot, his boots sinking into the soft earth. His heart pounded as he approached a small clearing. There it was, the blue station wagon parked outside a weathered cabin. Smoke curled from the chimney, and a soft glow spilled from the windows. Winston stayed hidden behind a tree, his breath coming in short bursts. He could see movement inside, a silhouette passing by the window. Taking a deep breath, Winston stepped into the clearing and knocked on the door. Joe Evans answered, his face registering surprise and then wariness when he saw Winston. "Officer Porter," he said, his tone guarded. "What brings you out here?" Winston kept his voice calm. "Mr. Evans, I apologize for dropping by unannounced, but I need to speak with Annabelle. It's important." Joe hesitated, his grip tightening on the doorframe. "She's resting. It's been a long day." "Please," Winston pressed. "It won't take long." Joe glanced back into the cabin, then sighed and stepped aside. "Fine, but keep it brief." Inside, the cabin was modest but cozy, with mismatched furniture and the warm scent of wood smoke. Annabelle sat at the kitchen table, her sketchbook open in front of her. She looked up as Winston entered, her expression wary. "Annabelle," Winston said gently, taking a step closer. "I wanted to ask you something. It's about your past." She frowned, her grip tightening on her pencil. "What about it? Do you remember anything from before you were with Joe? Anything at all?" His voice cracked slightly, betraying his emotion. Annabelle shook her head, her gaze falling to the table. "No, just bits and pieces. Water, mostly. And thunder." Joe stepped in, his voice firm. "That's enough, officer. She doesn't need to relive that." Winston's hands clenched at his sides. "Please, Joe. If there's even a chance she's my daughter." "She's not," Joe interrupted, his voice rising. "She's Annabelle. She's my niece, and she's happy here." Annabelle's eyes darted between the two men, confusion and fear flickering across her face. Winston took a step back, realizing he was pushing too hard. He turned to her, his voice softer now. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to upset you." She nodded slightly, but her expression remained guarded. As Winston left the cabin, the rain felt colder than before. He climbed into his patrol car, his mind a storm of emotions. If Annabelle was his Anna, he couldn't give up. But how could he prove it without destroying the fragile life she'd built with Joe? He gripped the steering wheel tightly. The truth was out there, just out of reach. And Winston Porter would do whatever it took to find it. Storms within and without. The rain fell steadily as Winston Porter sat in his patrol car, the engine idling on the side of Old Forest Road. The soft patter against the windshield mirrored the chaos in his mind. He stared at the steering wheel, replaying his encounter with Annabelle and Joe Evans. The way she looked at him, wary but curious, haunted him. She didn't recognize him, yet something in her mannerisms felt undeniably familiar. He thought of her humming that lullaby. It wasn't just a coincidence. It couldn't be. Anna had sung that very tune countless times before bedtime, her sweet voice filling the house with warmth. But Annabelle's distant eyes and lack of recognition made him doubt himself. Was he grasping at straws, or had the storm truly stolen his daughter and buried her memories? Winston gritted his teeth and slammed his hands on the steering wheel, the horn honking briefly in protest. He had never felt so powerless. If Annabelle was Anna, then the girl he loved and lost was alive, just out of reach. But how could he reach her without pushing too hard, without breaking what little trust she might have in him? The storm outside grew heavier, thunder rumbling in the distance. Winston forced himself to focus. He wasn't just a grieving father, he was a cop. Facts, not emotions, would get him answers. He pulled out his notebook and began listing every detail he'd observed at the cabin. Annabelle's reactions, Joe's protectiveness, the way she clutched that sketchbook like a lifeline. One thing was certain, Joe Evans knew more than he was letting on. Back at the station, Winston dove into the records. He needed to know everything about Joe Evans. Pulling up his file, he learned that Joe had lived a quiet, unremarkable life. A retired fisherman, he'd been off the radar for years, his only brushes with the law involving minor disputes over dock fees. Winston leaned closer to the screen. 2 years ago, Joe had filed paperwork to assume guardianship of Annabelle Evans, claiming she was his niece displaced by a storm. The timing was too perfect. His mind raced. If Joe had found Anna after the storm, why hadn't he come forward? Why keep her hidden? He jotted down every detail, his pen pressing harder with each passing thought. A knock on his office door broke his concentration. Sean Miller stepped in, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced with concern. "You've been at this for hours, partner," Sean said, setting a cup of coffee on the desk. "You look like you're running on fumes." "I'm fine," Winston muttered, though his haggard face and bloodshot eyes said otherwise. Sean sat across from him, folding his arms. "Winston, I get it. I can't imagine what you're feeling right now, but you need to be careful. If she's not Anna—" "She is," Winston interrupted, his voice firm. "I know she is." Sean hesitated, then nodded slowly. "If that's true, you'll need proof. You can't go off instinct alone." Winston nodded, gripping his pen tightly. "I know. That's why I need your help." The next morning, Winston and Sean parked a discreet distance from the cabin. Sean had reluctantly agreed to assist, his own doubts softened by Winston's unwavering conviction. They watched as Joe stepped outside, carrying a bundle of firewood. Annabelle was nowhere in sight. "We need to tread carefully," Sean said, scanning the area. "If he thinks we're stalking them, this could backfire." Winston nodded, his focus unshaken. "I just need more context. Something to tie her to Anna." Joe disappeared back into the cabin, and the two officers waited until the coast was clear. Moving quickly and quietly, they approached the property, staying low among the trees. From their vantage point, they could see inside through a side window. Annabelle sat at the kitchen table, her sketchbook open. She was drawing again, her hand moving fluidly across the page. Winston's breath caught as he recognized the subject, a small red umbrella floating on stormy waves. His chest tightened. That image was seared into his memory, a haunting fragment of the night Anna disappeared. "She remembers," he whispered, his voice trembling. "She just doesn't realize it." Sean frowned. "It's possible, but we need more than a drawing, Winston. You need something definitive." That night, Winston couldn't sleep. His mind was a storm of hope, doubt, and fear. He sat in his living room, staring at the cardboard box of Anna's belongings. Carefully, he lifted out her favorite book, a collection of bedtime stories they'd read together countless times. The worn pages were filled with her fingerprints, her laughter echoing in his mind as he remembered her favorite tales. He turned to the first page, where Anna's childish scrawl had marked her name. His thumb brushed over the faded ink, and an idea began to form. If Annabelle truly was Anna, her memories might not surface on their own. But what if he could trigger them? The following day, Winston returned to the cabin. He arrived unannounced, a carefully packed bag of Anna's belongings in hand. Joe opened the door, his expression immediately wary. "What are you doing here again, Porter?" Joe asked, his tone edged with frustration. "I'm not here to argue," Winston said, keeping his voice calm. I brought some things. They might help her remember." Joe hesitated, his hand tightening on the doorframe. Annabelle appeared behind him, her eyes curious but guarded. Winston's breath hitched at the sight of her, but he held steady. "Annabelle," he said gently, holding up the book, "would you like to see this? It's a collection of stories. My daughter used to love it." Her gaze flickered between Winston and Joe. Finally, she nodded. "Okay." Joe stepped aside reluctantly, letting Winston enter. He placed the book on the kitchen table, opening it to the first page. Annabelle's eyes widened as she saw the name scrawled inside. That's my handwriting," she murmured, tracing the letters with her fingers. Winston swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. "It is." Annabelle looked up at him, her expression a mix of confusion and fear. "Who am I?" she asked, her voice trembling. The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken truths. Winston's heart ached for the daughter he had lost, and the young woman standing before him, caught between two identities. "You're Annabelle," Joe said firmly, his voice protective. Winston met Annabelle's gaze, his own filled with quiet determination. "You're Anna," he said softly. "My Anna." Tears welled in her eyes as she looked between them, the weight of her fractured past pressing down on her. And for the first time, Winston saw something new in her expression, a flicker of recognition, a fragile thread connecting her to the life she'd forgotten. The storm outside intensified, lightning illuminating the cabin. But within its walls, another storm was brewing, one of memory, identity, and the search for truth. Fractured memories. The storm raged outside the cabin, lightning illuminating the dark forest in brief, blinding flashes. Thunder rolled like the earth itself was groaning under the weight of secrets he had uncovered. Inside, the tension was just as electric. Annabelle sat at the kitchen table, her trembling hands clutching the book Winston had brought. Her wide eyes darted between the two men, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. "Anna," Winston whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't remember, but this was your favorite book. I used to read it to you every night before bed." Annabelle shook her head, her lips pressing into a thin line. I don't know. I don't remember this book, but..." Her fingers traced the childish scrawl of her name on the inside cover. "But this handwriting, it's mine. I know it is." Joe Evans leaned heavily against the doorframe, his face pale and drawn. "Annabelle," he said firmly, though his voice carried a note of pleading, "you don't have to listen to this. You know who you are." Annabelle's head snapped toward him, her eyes searching his face. "Do I? Uncle Joe, why don't I remember anything before you?" Joe hesitated, his mouth opening and closing as he searched for words. Winston seized the moment, stepping closer but careful not to push too hard. "Annabelle," he said gently, crouching to her eye level, "I know this is overwhelming. I know it's confusing, but I need you to trust me. You're my daughter. I spent 8 years searching for you, hoping against hope that you were still alive." Her breath hitched at the raw emotion in his voice. But why don't I remember you? Why don't I feel anything when I look at you?" "Sometimes," a voice interjected, soft but steady, "memories get buried under trauma. Your mind protects you by locking them away." Dr. Lila Robertson stepped into the room, her calm presence cutting through the storm of emotions. Winston had called her in desperation earlier that day, knowing they needed a professional to help navigate the delicate situation. She carried her leather bag and a small box, setting them on the table. Joe's eyes narrowed. "Who is this?" "I'm Dr. Lila Robertson," she said, her tone even but not unkind. "I'm a psychologist, and I specialize in trauma recovery. I'm here to help Annabelle. Nothing more." Joe crossed his arms, his stance protective. "She doesn't need help. She's fine the way she is." Annabelle looked at him sharply. "I'm not fine, Uncle Joe. I don't even know who I am." Her voice broke, tears spilling down her cheeks. Dr. Robertson placed a gentle hand on Annabelle's shoulder. "It's okay to feel that way," she said softly. "It's okay to want answers." The storm outside grew fiercer, wind howling through the trees and rattling the cabin's windows. Dr. Robertson opened her small box, revealing a collection of sensory items. A soft piece of fabric, a seashell, a photograph of a red umbrella, and a music box. "Sometimes," Dr. Robertson began, "objects can help us remember things. They can unlock feelings or images buried deep in our minds. Annabelle, would you be willing to try this with me?" Annabelle hesitated, her hands tightening around the book. She glanced at Joe, then at Winston, before finally nodding. "Okay." Dr. Robertson smiled encouragingly and slid the photograph across the table. "Let's start with this." Annabelle picked up the photo, her brow furrowing as she stared at it. It was a simple image of a red umbrella against a gray sky, but something about it made her heart race. She pressed her fingers to her temple, her breathing quickening. "I've seen this," she whispered, her voice shaky. It was floating in the water, the night of the storm. Winston's breath caught. "Yes, Anna. That was your umbrella. You loved it. I held it over us during storms so you wouldn't get wet." Tears streamed down her face as she clutched the photo. "I can see it, but it's blurry. Everything's blurry. There's water everywhere, and I'm so scared. I'm calling for someone, but I don't know who." "It was me," Winston said, his voice trembling. "You called for me. I tried to reach you, but the storm, it pulled you away." Joe stepped forward, his face pale. "That's enough," he said, his voice rising. "You're pushing her too hard." Annabelle slammed her hands on the table, standing abruptly. "No, Uncle Joe. I want to remember. I have to." Her outburst left the room in stunned silence. Even the storm seemed to pause for a moment, the wind outside falling to a low whistle. Joe looked at her, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "Annabelle," he said quietly, "I found you after the storm. You were half drowned, unconscious. When you woke up, you didn't know who you were or where you came from. I didn't know how to help you, so I kept you with me. I told myself it was the right thing to do." Winston's fists clenched at his sides. "You didn't try to find her family. You didn't think someone might be looking for her." Joe looked away, guilt etched deeply into his face. I convinced myself she'd been abandoned, that no one was coming for her. I was wrong." Dr. Robertson intervened before the tension could boil over. She opened the music box, letting the delicate melody fill the room. Annabelle froze, her eyes wide, as she listened. "I know this song," she murmured, her voice distant. She began humming along, her tone uncertain at first, but growing stronger with each note. Winston's heart swelled as he recognized the melody, the lullaby he had sung to Anna every night. "You used to fall asleep to that song," he said softly. "It was your favorite." Annabelle's hands flew to her mouth as more tears streamed down her face. Images flashed in her mind. A warm bed, a man's soothing voice, a pair of arms holding her close. She looked up at Winston, her eyes searching his face. "I see you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You were there. You were holding me." Winston stepped closer, his own tears spilling over. "Yes, sweetheart. I was. And I'm here now. I've always been here." The storm outside reached its peak, but inside the cabin, the tension began to ease. Annabelle sat between Winston and Joe, her hands still clutching the music box. For the first time, the fragile threads of her past seemed to be weaving together. "I don't know who I am yet," she said quietly, looking between the two men. "But I want to find out." Winston nodded, his voice steady despite the emotion in his chest. "And we'll help you. Both of us." Joe hesitated, then placed a hand on her shoulder. "I just want what's best for you, Annabelle, whatever that means." As the storm began to wane, the three of them sat together, united by the promise of a future no longer weighed down by the past. Rebuilding bridges. The cabin's wooden floors creaked softly under Winston's boots as he paced the living room, his hands jammed into his pockets. His heart was a tangled mess of emotions: relief that Annabelle had begun to remember, anger at Joe for keeping her hidden, and a gnawing fear that too much too soon could fracture her fragile psyche. Across the room, Annabelle sat cross-legged on the floor, staring at the music box in her hands. The lullaby's haunting melody played softly, her fingers tracing its polished surface as if searching for answers. Joe sat nearby, his elbows on his knees and his head bowed, his usually confident demeanor replaced by a quiet resignation. "How could you?" Winston finally asked, his voice low but sharp. "How could you keep her from me for 2 years? Did you even think about what I was going through?" Joe looked up, his face etched with guilt. "You think I don't feel that every day?" He shot back. "I thought I was doing the right thing." She was scared, confused. She didn't remember anything. And with everything going on after the storm, I didn't think anyone was still looking for her. Winston's jaw tightened. "You should have tried. You should have done something." Joe sighed heavily. "And maybe I failed her. But I loved her, Porter. I still do. She's not just some lost kid to me. She's family." The room fell silent, the only sound the faint ticking of an old clock on the mantel. Annabelle's voice broke the tension, quiet but resolute. "Stop it, both of you." She looked up, her brown eyes shimmering with tears. "I don't care what either of you thought you were doing. All I know is that I spent 2 years not knowing who I am, and now I feel like I'm being pulled in 2 different directions. It's too much." Winston's heart clenched as he knelt beside her. "I'm sorry, Annabelle. I didn't mean to make this harder for you." Joe nodded from his seat. "Me neither, kiddo. I just want to protect you." Annabelle looked between them, her gaze softening. "I need both of you to stop fighting and start helping me figure this out. Can you do that?" Winston and Joe exchanged a look. It wasn't friendly, but it was an unspoken agreement. They would set aside their differences for her. The next morning, Winston stood in his living room, carefully arranging items on the coffee table. The box of Anna's belongings sat open, its contents chosen with care: her favorite teddy bear, a pair of rain boots she'd decorated with painted flowers, and a crayon drawing she'd once taped to their refrigerator. Each item held a memory, a piece of a life they'd shared before the storm. When the knock came at the door, Winston's heart leaped. He opened it to find Joe and Annabelle standing together. Annabelle held her sketchbook close, her expression nervous but determined. "Thank you for coming," Winston said, stepping aside to let them in. Annabelle hesitated, her eyes scanning the room before settling on the table. She walked over and knelt beside it, picking up the teddy bear. Her fingers brushed over its matted fur, lingering on the small patch where it had been sewn. "Mr. Snuggles," she murmured, her voice barely audible. She looked up at Winston, confusion clouding her face. "That's his name, isn't it?" Winston nodded, his throat tight. "Yes. You named him when you were 5. He went everywhere with you." Annabelle hugged the bear to her chest, her eyes filling with tears. "I think I remember, just a little. You were sitting on the couch, sewing him. I was watching you." Joe stepped closer, his face a mixture of relief and sadness. "That's good, kiddo. It's a start." Annabelle turned to the rain boots next, picking one up and running her thumb over the faded flower patterns. She smiled faintly. "I painted these, didn't I?" "You did," Winston said, his voice soft. "You insisted on painting flowers because you wanted them to look like a garden in the rain." Her laughter was small but genuine. That sounds like something I'd do. Later, the three of them sat together, piecing through the memories Annabelle could recall and the ones that still eluded her. Dr. Lila Robertson joined them, her calm guidance helping to navigate the emotional terrain. Sometimes, Dr. Robertson explained, memories come back in flashes. Other times, it takes an experience or a familiar place to trigger them. Annabelle, what you're feeling is completely normal. There's no rush. Annabelle nodded, her gaze distant. I just wish I could remember everything. It's like there's a fog in my head, and I can't see through it. That fog will clear when you're ready, Dr. Robertson said gently. For now, focus on what feels right. You don't have to figure it all out at once. As the days passed, Winston and Joe worked together to create a safe space for Annabelle to explore her past. They took her to places she used to love. The park where she learned to ride her bike, the ice cream shop where she'd always ordered strawberry, the small pier where she used to collect seashells. Each outing brought flickers of recognition, small pieces of a puzzle slowly coming together. But it wasn't until they visited the beach, where Anna had disappeared, that the breakthrough came. Standing at the edge of the water, Annabelle froze, her body tense. The waves lapped at her feet, the salty breeze tugging at her hair. Her eyes filled with tears as she whispered, "This is where it happened, isn't it?" Winston nodded, his chest tight with emotion. "Yes, sweetheart. This is where the storm came. This is where I lost you." Annabelle closed her eyes, her breathing shallow. For a long moment, she was silent. Then, as if a dam had broken, the memories came rushing back. "I remember the rain," she said, her voice trembling. "I was standing here with you. The wind was so strong, and you were holding my hand. Then the wave came, and I couldn't hold on." Winston wrapped his arms around her as she sobbed, his own tears falling freely. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "I tried to reach you. I tried to save you." Annabelle clung to him, her voice muffled against his chest. "You didn't fail me, Dad. You found me. You brought me back." Joe watched from a distance, his face unreadable. When Annabelle pulled away, she turned to him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you for taking care of me," she said softly. "I'll always be grateful for that." Joe nodded, his voice thick. "You're welcome, kiddo. I just wanted you to be safe." As the sun set over the water, the three of them stood together, their shadows stretching long across the sand. The storm that had torn them apart no longer defined them. They had weathered it, and now, for the first time in years, they were rebuilding together. The golden rays of the setting sun painted the beach in hues of orange and pink as Annabelle stood between Winston and Joe. Her eyes were still red from crying, but there was a calmness in her posture that hadn't been there before. She hugged herself tightly, the cool breeze brushing against her cheeks as her memories danced just out of reach, teasing her with fragments of familiarity. Winston stayed close, unsure whether to speak or let the moment stretch. Every instinct told him to say something, to reassure her, but he also knew that this journey had to be hers. She needed to find her way back on her own terms. "I keep seeing flashes," Annabelle finally said, breaking the silence. Her voice was quiet, hesitant, but steady, like, "I'm underwater, and everything's spinning. There's thunder and rain. I remember calling out for someone, and I remember your face." She looked at Winston, her gaze searching. "You were yelling my name." Winston's breath caught in his throat. He nodded slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. I was calling for you. I didn't stop until I couldn't stand anymore. And even then, I didn't give up hope." Annabelle's lips quivered, and she wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. She turned to Joe, who stood a few steps away, watching with a mixture of relief and sadness. "And you found me," she said softly. "You saved me." Joe's face crumpled as he nodded. "You were barely alive. I didn't think you'd make it, But you fought so hard, Annabelle. You were so strong. I told myself you were meant to stay with me." She walked over to him, reaching out to take his hand. "You gave me a home when I didn't have one," she said. "You kept me safe, but I need to know who I was before that. I need to know where I came from." Joe nodded, his weathered face streaked with tears. "I know, kiddo. I know." The drive back from the beach was quiet, the hum of the car engine the only sound. Annabelle sat in the back seat, her sketchbook resting on her lap. She hadn't opened it, instead staring out the window as the night swallowed the horizon. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions, grief for the time she'd lost, gratitude for Joe, and a tentative hope that she might finally reclaim her identity. Winston glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" She met his eyes in the reflection, her lips forming a faint, tired smile. "I think so. I feel like I'm standing on the edge of something. Like I'm so close to remembering everything, but I can't quite get there." "It'll come," he said gently. "When you're ready, it'll come." Joe, seated in the passenger seat, remained silent. His hands were clasped tightly in his lap, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. Winston could feel the weight of his presence, the unspoken tension between them. But for Annabelle's sake, they both kept their emotions in check. Back at Winston's house, the three of them gathered in the living room. Annabelle settled into the couch, her fingers tracing the edges of the sketchbook she still hadn't opened. Winston placed a steaming mug of tea in front of her before sitting across from her, while Joe leaned against the doorway, his arms crossed. Dr. Lila Robertson had suggested they take small steps, allowing Annabelle to process her emotions without overwhelming her. Winston remembered her words clearly. Let her take the lead. Let her decide how much she wants to uncover and when. This isn't just about finding the truth. It's about helping her feel safe. Annabelle finally broke the silence, her voice barely audible. "Do you have pictures of me from before?" Winston's heart squeezed, and he nodded quickly. "I do. I kept every photo, every drawing, everything I could. Wait here." He disappeared into the next room, returning with a leather-bound photo album. The corners were worn, the edges frayed, but the pictures inside were carefully preserved. He handed it to her with trembling hands. Annabelle opened the album slowly, her eyes scanning each image. There was a photo of her as a baby, bundled in a soft pink blanket. Another of her at the park, laughing as she fed ducks with a younger Winston by her side. As she turned the pages, her breath caught at a picture of her holding a red umbrella, grinning brightly despite the rain. "It's you," Winston said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "You were always so full of life, Anna. You lit up every room you walked into." Annabelle touched the photo, her fingers trembling. I remember this," she whispered. "It was raining, and you told me we were on an adventure. You said the rain couldn't stop us." Winston blinked back tears. "That's right. You called it our rainy day mission." Joe watched from the doorway, his face unreadable. He cleared his throat, drawing their attention. "She was always brave," he said quietly. "Even when she didn't remember, she never let fear win." Annabelle looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "You helped me find that strength, Uncle Joe. I don't know how I would have survived without you." Joe smiled faintly, his voice gruff. "You didn't need me to survive. You did that on your own. I just gave you a place to start over." As the night wore on, the three of them stayed up talking, piecing together fragments of Annabelle's past and present. It wasn't perfect, and there were still gaps in her memory, but for the first time, she felt like she was starting to understand who she was. "I think I'm both," she said at one point, her voice thoughtful. "I'm Anna, and I'm Annabelle. I can't erase who I've been through, but I don't want to forget who I was either." Winston nodded, his chest swelling with pride. "You don't have to choose. You're both, and you're amazing just the way you are." Joe added, his voice softer than usual. "We'll be here for you, kiddo." no matter what. The storm outside had long since passed, leaving the night quiet and still. But inside, the bonds between them were stronger than ever, a family piecing itself back together one moment at a time. A new dawn. The first rays of morning light filtered through the blinds, casting long streaks of gold across Winston Porter's living room. The storm had passed, leaving the world outside fresh and renewed. Inside, the air was heavy with the weight of revelations from the night before, but also charged with an unspoken hope. Annabelle sat on the couch, still clutching the leather-bound photo album Winston had given her. Her fingers ran over the faded images, as if touching them could bring the memories fully to life. Joe Evans stood by the window, sipping a cup of coffee, his face unreadable as he stared out at the quiet street. Winston busied himself in the kitchen, the familiar clatter of cups and plates a grounding sound in the wake of so much emotional upheaval. "Breakfast is ready," Winston called, his voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. Annabelle looked up, blinking as though emerging from a dream. "I'm not really hungry," she said softly, her gaze dropping back to the album. "You should eat something," Winston urged gently, bringing a plate of scrambled eggs and toast to the table. "It's going to be a big day." Joe raised an eyebrow. "Big day? What's that supposed to mean?" Winston hesitated, glancing at Annabelle. "I thought, maybe we could go to the park, the one we used to visit, Anna. There's something I want to show you." Annabelle tilted her head, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "What's at the park?" Winston offered a small, hesitant smile. "A piece of your childhood. Something I think might help you remember." Joe set his coffee down, his expression guarded. "Are you sure that's a good idea? She's been through a lot already." Annabelle straightened, her voice firm. "I want to go. I want to see." The drive to the park was quiet, the tension in the car palpable. Winston kept glancing at Annabelle in the rearview mirror, while Joe stared out the window, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. Annabelle clutched the photo album to her chest, her fingers tracing its worn edges. When they arrived, the sight of the park took Winston's breath away. It was exactly as he remembered. The winding trails, the small duck pond, and the wooden gazebo where he and Anna had shared countless afternoons. For Annabelle, however, the place was both familiar and alien, like a word on the tip of her tongue. "This way," Winston said, leading her toward the gazebo. His heart pounded with every step. Annabelle followed, her gaze sweeping over the playground where children laughed and played. She paused near a tall oak tree, her brow furrowing as she stared at its wide trunk. "I've been here before," she murmured, almost to herself. Winston's breath caught. "Yes," he said softly. "You used to love climbing that tree. You always said it made you feel like you could touch the sky." Annabelle placed a hand on the rough bark, her eyes filling with tears. I think I remember. You used to catch me when I jumped down, didn't you?" "I did," Winston replied, his voice trembling. "You'd laugh and tell me you were flying." They reached the gazebo, where Winston paused, his hands shaking slightly as he reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small weathered key and unlocked a hidden compartment beneath one of the benches. From it, he retrieved a tin box, its surface scratched and dented, but still intact. "What's that?" Annabelle asked, her voice laced with curiosity. Winston handed her the box, his hands trembling. "It's a time capsule we buried together. You wanted to leave something behind for the future. Do you remember?" Annabelle's fingers brushed over the tin, her expression a mixture of wonder and apprehension. "No," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I want to." She opened the box slowly, revealing its contents: a small bracelet made of colorful beads, a hand-drawn map of the park, and a Polaroid photo of Winston and a much younger Anna, both grinning widely. Tears welled in her eyes as she picked up the bracelet. "I made this," she whispered, slipping it over her wrist. It was too small, but she didn't care. "I remember making this. You helped me tie the knot." Winston knelt beside her, tears streaming down his face. "That's right. You wanted it to be perfect, and I told you it already was." Annabelle looked at him, her face a mixture of joy and heartbreak. "You really are my dad," she said, the words more a realization than a question. "I always have been," Winston said, his voice breaking. "And I always will be." Joe watched from a distance, his face shadowed by a mix of emotions. When Annabelle turned to him, her gaze was steady but filled with gratitude. "Uncle Joe," she said softly, "I'll never forget what you did for me. You gave me a home when I didn't have one. You kept me safe. You were my family when I didn't know who I was." Joe's throat bobbed as he struggled to speak. "You'll always be my family, Annabelle, no matter what." She hugged him tightly, her tears soaking into his shirt. "Thank you for everything," she whispered. "But I need to know who I am, and I need to know my dad." Joe nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "You deserve that." As the sun set over the park, the three of them sat together by the duck pond, watching the water ripple in the fading light. Annabelle leaned her head on Winston's shoulder, her sketchbook open in her lap. She began to draw, her pencil moving with purpose. "What are you drawing?" Winston asked, his voice soft. "A new memory," she replied, smiling faintly. "The three of us, here, together." Winston's heart swelled with pride and love. He placed an arm around her, holding her close. "You're home now, Anna," he said. "You're home." The world felt quieter, the pain of the past softened by the promise of a brighter future. Together, they would rebuild, one moment at a time. Epilogue. A week later, Annabelle stood in front of the small granite marker in Evergreen Cemetery. It bore the words, "Anna Porter, beloved daughter, forever in our hearts." She knelt and placed her hand on the cool stone. "I'm not gone," she whispered. "I'm here, and I'm ready to live again." Behind her, Winston and Joe stood side by side, watching in silence. For the first time, they shared a sense of unity, a shared purpose to help Annabelle reclaim her life. As she rose and turned to face them, her smile lit up the world. She was no longer lost, she was found, and her journey was just beginning. The sunlight filtered through the trees as Annabelle stood before the grave marker. The name etched into the granite, Anna Porter, beloved daughter, forever in our hearts, no longer felt like an epitaph, but a reminder of the girl she had once been and the life she was reclaiming. She traced the letters with her fingers, her heart heavy with emotion. Winston stood a few steps behind her, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. Joe stood beside him, his weathered face unreadable but calm. They had all agreed to come here, to face this marker together, as a way to close one chapter and begin another. "I feel like I'm saying goodbye to someone I don't fully remember," Annabelle said softly, her voice trembling. "But I also feel like I'm meeting her for the first time." Winston took a hesitant step forward. "You're not saying goodbye, Anna. You're bringing her with you. She's always been a part of you, even when you didn't know it." Annabelle turned to face him, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I'm scared, Dad. I don't know how to be her again. I don't know if I can." Winston stepped closer, placing his hands gently on her shoulders. "You don't have to be the girl you were. You get to decide who you want to be now. Anna, Annabelle, or both, you get to choose, and I'll be here for you, no matter what." Joe cleared his throat, stepping forward as well. "He's right, kiddo. You don't have to figure it all out today. You've got time, and you've got us." Annabelle looked between them, her eyes searching their faces. For the first time, she felt the weight of the love and support surrounding her, stronger than the confusion or fear she carried. She smiled through her tears and nodded. "Okay." That evening, the three of them returned to Winston's house, where Dr. Lila Robertson was waiting. She had been instrumental in guiding them through the delicate process of helping Annabelle reconnect with her past, and now she sat at the kitchen table, a calm, reassuring presence. "How are you feeling, Annabelle?" Dr. Robertson asked, her voice gentle. Annabelle hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Lighter," she said, "like I'm not carrying so much alone anymore." Dr. Robertson nodded approvingly. "That's a good start. Remember, this is a journey, not a race. You've already taken incredible steps forward." Winston placed a hand on Annabelle's shoulder, his heart swelling with pride. "She's amazing," he said, his voice full of emotion. "She always has been." Joe nodded from his seat by the window. "She's got more strength in her than most people twice her age." Annabelle blushed, a shy smile spreading across her face. "I couldn't have done it without all of you." Dr. Robertson smiled. "And you don't have to do it alone moving forward. You have a family now. A big, complicated, wonderful family." Over the next few weeks, Annabelle settled into a new rhythm. She spent her days exploring her old memories and creating new ones. Winston took her to places from her childhood: the school she used to attend, the park where she learned to ride her bike, and the library where she had spent hours lost in books. Each visit brought flickers of recognition, pieces of her past slotting into place. Joe remained a constant presence, a source of quiet strength and unwavering support. He and Winston found themselves slowly building a tentative friendship, united by their love for Annabelle and their shared goal of helping her heal. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Annabelle sat in the backyard, her sketchbook open on her lap. She was drawing a picture of the three of them, Winston, Joe, and herself standing together by the duck pond. The lines were careful, the details vivid. It was her way of capturing the new family they had become. Winston joined her, sitting on the grass beside her. He watched her draw, his heart full. "That's beautiful," he said softly. Annabelle looked up at him, her smile radiant. "It feels right," she said, "like I'm finally finding my place." Winston nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "You've always had a place, Anna. You're home now." Epilogue. Months later, on a bright spring morning, Annabelle stood on the porch of Winston's house, her hand resting on the railing, as she looked out at the blooming garden. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of fresh earth and flowers. She felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. Joe pulled up in his old station wagon, stepping out with a warm smile. "Ready for your big day, kiddo?" he called. Annabelle turned to him, her smile wide. "Ready." Winston appeared behind her, carrying a picnic basket. "The park's waiting," he said, his voice filled with excitement. Together, the three of them climbed into the car and headed to the park, where Dr. Robertson and a few close friends were waiting. It wasn't a grand occasion, but it was meaningful, a celebration of Annabelle's journey and the family that had formed around her. As they sat together by the duck pond, Annabelle looked around at the people who had become her world. She felt whole, not because she had all the answers, but because she had found the courage to embrace both her past and her future. "I'm not just Anna," she said, her voice steady and confident. "And I'm not just Annabelle. I'm both, and I'm okay with that." Winston reached for her hand, his eyes shining with pride. "You're more than okay, sweetheart. You're extraordinary." And as the ducks paddled across the shimmering water and laughter filled the air, Annabelle knew she had finally come home, not just to a place, but to herself.